Good morning, Professor Freemont. Your evidence will be taken by Miss Graham, Senior Counsel to the inquiry, whom you have, I think, already met.
I have, yes.
Would you now take the oath in Scottish form by simply remain seated, but raise your right hand, if you will, and say the words after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That I will tell the truth.
That I will tell the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Good morning.
Good morning.
You are Dr. Freemont, Anthony J. Freemont. And what age are you, Doctor?
I'm 70.
You're a consultant in osteoarticular pathology, and I wondered if you could briefly explain what that actually is.
Yes. I'm a histopathologist, and in histopathology there are a number of different subspecialties. And osteoarticular pathology is one of those, and during my working life I worked with just diseases of bones and joints, and that's where the osteoarticular comes in. I was slightly more specialised than that sounds, in that I dealt just with what's called medical pathology, so the pathology of arthritis, the pathology of metabolic bone diseases, and the pathology of fractures, rather than tumours.
And as I understand it, there are not many who work in the field of that speciality, if I can call it that.
I was the only one who worked in just medical osteoarticular pathology in the country, and around the country, other osteoarticular pathologists, there might have been 5 or 6 of us.
Right. And when you say the country, you mean the whole of the UK?
The whole of the UK, yes.
And in the circumstances that we're interested in, we've heard evidence already in the inquiry from Dr. Shearer, who is a forensic pathologist, and she indicated that there had been a fractured rib. After she carried out the initial post-mortem, it was discovered. We'll come to that later today. But I think that was why you were brought in to give advice about that fractured rib.
Yes, it was usual for paediatric pathologists and home office pathologists to send what they believed to be fractured bones to my laboratory. So although I didn't undertake post-mortem examinations, I used to receive, really from the whole country, pieces of bone where pathologists were concerned that there might have been a fracture.
And they would come to you to get your specialist advice on those matters?
Yes.
Thank you. And so, just over the years, how many fractures would you say you've looked at?
Oh, thousands. I can't remember, but
no.
Yeah.
Thousands in your career?
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at something for me, please? It's an inquiry statement, and I think you were asked to give a very detailed statement about your involvement in relation to these matters, and that is SBPI 00310. And you'll see that comes onto the screen in front of you, and it's headed Witness Statement, Professor Anthony Freemont, and it was taken on the 15th of December 2022 and Friday the 6th of January this year.
That is correct.
And before I begin asking you questions about this, I see you've got the folder in front of you. Now, you will have a hard copy of this document, and we've tried to provide you with hard copies of everything that you might find helpful.
Thank you.
So if you prefer working from hard copies, and many witnesses do, feel free to just simply look through it and refer to it as you wish.
Okay, I'm happy with this.
In addition, we've got it coming up on the screen so that everyone can see what we're looking at. So first of all, we've got the inquiry statement, and I wonder if you would, it's 45 pages long, would you look at the final page, please? We'll bring the final page up on the screen. And here you'll see, just beneath paragraph 154, that the date that's given is the 20th of April 2023, and that's the date that you signed your inquiry statement.
Yes.
Now, you'll see on the screen your signature's been redacted, so no one can see that publicly, although I think your hard copy might have your signature.
It does.
But you signed every page of that statement, as I
did,
understand
yes.
it? Thank you.
Electronically. But
Yes. I think since COVID, arrangements have been made to allow people to do that.
Yeah.
And can we see paragraph 154, please? And it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And I think you understood that when you signed the document.
I did, yes.
And so you understand that this will be available for the chair to consider at length, and it will also be made available to the public and be published on the website as well
I
after
understand.
you've given evidence.
Yes.
Thank you. And we have all of your details in this statement, and so I don't need to take you through that at length. But in anticipation of you giving evidence today, I understand you've prepared some PowerPoint slides
I have.
which will assist you in sharing your knowledge with the chair. Is that
Yes.
correct? Would you look for me, please, at SBPI 00324, which should be 29 slides, which you've prepared on our behalf?
Yes.
What I plan to do today, Professor, is just simply go through each of the slides and ask you additional questions about that. But obviously the chair has your full inquiry statement as well, and he has your full report, so he can look at all of those items. Well, let's start with the first slide, if I may. And it says Professor Anthony Freemont, and I apologise, I think I accidentally called you doctor when I first spoke to you there. I hope you haven't taken any offence at
None
that.
whatsoever, no.
Thank you. We see a lot of qualifications listed. I wonder if you could help the chair just understand a little bit about your background, if you could tell us.
Yes, when I was at medical school, I was offered the opportunity to take a year out, and I undertook a BSc in human anatomy. That was at the University of London. Then I went on and completed my medical education, and that's represented by the MBBS, Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery. I also at that time took the examination for membership of the Royal College of Surgeons, which is MRCS, and passed that. I continued working I started working as a physician at the University of Leicester. And while I was there, I took the examinations that are necessary to go on to become a consultant in medicine as a physician, which is MRCP. And then I moved to Manchester to become a histopathologist. I moved there because I'd always had an interest in diseases of bones and joints as a physician, and there was a very highly specialised pathologist there, and so I moved into his group, and he trained me in bone and joint pathology. While I was with him, I undertook research which led to the doctorate in medicine. In America, MD is just the title given to someone who has graduated in medicine. In the UK, it's a doctorate degree. It's the medical equivalent of a PhD, so I was awarded that, and then I took my examinations to become a consultant in pathology, in histopathology, and that's where the MRC path came from.
And then I see that you're a fellow of certain royal colleges.
Yes.
Tell us which royal colleges you're a fellow of.
Okay. Well, once you've reached a sort of consultant status, and particularly if you're a researcher, the royal colleges will look towards, I suppose rewarding is a good word, look towards rewarding continued development and contribution to the specialties. And one of those Royal Colleges was the Royal College of Pathologists, so they made me a Fellow of the Royal College of Pathologists. But as I've explained, I undertook a lot of my work in the medical area of pathology. And so 2 Royal Colleges of Pathology, of medicine, physicians, awarded me fellowships. So Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of the United Kingdom, that's based in London, and a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, because I used to do a lot of work with the rheumatologists here in Edinburgh.
And as I understand it, not everyone can become a fellow. It's not like membership where you pay your money and join. You actually, it's recognition of your
It is, of your contribution. Yeah.
Thank you. And so you're a member of a fellow of 3 Royal Colleges.
Yes.
And then it says that you're a Professor of Pathology at the University of Manchester. Can you explain to the public what it means that you're emeritus?
Yes, that means that I have retired, and because of the contribution that I made to the university, I worked at Manchester University for 40 years. I was a leading researcher, and I also ran the medical school for some time as well. As a consequence of that, when I retired, I was awarded emeritus status, which means that I'm, although not an employee of the University of Manchester, I have all the rights and privileges, so I can continue to do research, I can use the library facilities and so on. So that's what that means.
And is that a benefit that you continue to enjoy today?
Oh yes, yes.
And am I right in saying, we'll come to your CV in a moment, but you retired in 2021? Actually, I see it's at the bottom of the slide on retirement.
Oh yes, yes I did. I retired from the university in 2021. Half of my work was always for the National Health Service, and I retired from the National Health Service in 2018, so I stopped being a consultant in 2018. I carried on working for the university in a sort of research capacity until 2021, and I retired then because I had leukemia and I knew I was about to start treatment, so that's why I retired.
I'm very sorry to hear that.
Oh,
and then at the end of this slide, it says you're a Proctor Professor of Pathology. Can you explain to people what that means?
Yes, there's a hierarchy of professors nationally and locally. The highest of those is a Regius Professor, and then the next level down, as it were, is a named chair. That means a chair that's been endowed to a university, and that's where the proctor came from. It was a Professor Proctor who endowed the chair in pathology. That was a named chair. I still kept my my official title of Professor of Osteoarticular Pathology, and because of the work that I was doing from my retirement from the NHS until 2021, I was also a Professor of Biomedical Egyptology.
So a number of other accolades or acknowledgements
Yes.
of your status there. And Professor of Biomedical Egyptology, what is that? Does that involve?
In Manchester, because of the very rich people who were responsible for the cotton industry, a number of these people went off to Egypt and brought back mummies, and a lot of mummies. And they are housed in the Manchester Museum, which is part of the university. When I was towards the end of my career, when I was both a consultant and a university professor, I was funded by the Medical Research Council to undertake a lot of research into how new tests could be designed and then introduced into the National Health Service. And the university then received an endowment from a wealthy lady who was very interested in Egyptology itself. And I was asked if some of the technologies that I applied in my NHS and university work, and in particular looking at molecules within mummified tissue, which is partly decomposed tissue, might help us to better understand who the ancient Egyptians were, what their lifestyles were like, how they ate, what they ate, and so on. And with this wealth of material that we could access because of all the mummies that had been brought to Manchester, we were able to make some very interesting observations using these new technologies.
And that was work that you undertook as part of your work at Manchester University?
Yes, I had a lecturer who worked with me who was a very, very good geneticist. I'm a molecular pathologist, but not a geneticist. And the two of us worked very well together to build up a pattern of, as I say, who the Egyptians were, what illnesses they had. And because we had so many of these mummies, we were able to do statistical analysis that looked at populations as well as looking at individuals.
Thank you. Now, in terms of your CV, you've provided us with a copy of a CV. We don't need to have it on the screen. For those who are interested, it's WIT 00015. And you also give some details in your inquiry statement about your career between paragraphs 2 and 7 of your inquiry statement. One of the things I noticed was that in July 2021, you were appointed by the Home Office to train the next generation of osteoarticular pathologists. I wonder if you could tell the Chair a little something about that appointment.
Yes. During the years that I undertook medico-legal work, usually for the police but also for the defence, I had and developed further an expertise in fractures. It also fitted in with my research, where I had funding, again from the Medical Research Council, to look into the mechanisms by which fractures occurred and healed, and at both the microscopic level and the molecular level. And for some part of that time, there were 2 pathologists in the United Kingdom working in that area, and that was a very equable arrangement, because quite often both the police and the defence would want to have an experienced pathologist working in those areas. When the other pathologist retired, there was just me delivering all the opinions in the area around fractures, and this particularly affected fractures of infants, and that really wasn't tenable. So I brought on board another pathologist who I trained, and when I retired, he was the only pathologist, and the amount of work has increased dramatically. And as a consequence, I mean, he was still working as an NHS consultant, he's still a university professor, and he was trying to cope with all of this work. And a large backlog built up, a backlog of 10 months. And of course, this was at the same time that we had lockdown, and things were all that little bit less well oiled as the system works as a consequence. So I started to write up all my experience as scientific papers, so that pathologists like Home Office pathologists or paediatric pathologists could look down the microscope at fractures, and using algorithms which I developed, they could have predicted the date of fractures, but they were naturally cautious about doing that, because they didn't have the sort of background that I had. Aging fractures varies in in infants and adults of different ages, people with different medical diseases as well. And so that didn't really relieve the pressure on my colleague, or my colleague before I retired. And I was contacted by the Home Office in 2021 and asked if I would come back to work. I lived close to an orthopaedic hospital, and they were prepared to do the preparation of the tissue sections and so on. But I explained to them my medical problems, and they said, well, would I be prepared to train another pathologist, so that we were back with two. So I started that person's training. I then unfortunately became ill with COVID last year, and spent a lot of time in hospital. But I'd given him the background and the basics, and he then went to work with my other colleague and is now fully qualified as an osteoarticular pathologist. In the meantime, I have taken new cases so that my original pathology colleague would then be in a position to clear his backlog. And I'm still taking new cases from the police and from defence lawyers as well. And I've done that really, apart from this spell in hospital, for 2 years now, well, year and a half.
And I think I've read in your CV that you have, in England and Scotland, written over 400 medical legal reports over your career.
Yes, that's correct.
And you've been appointed, as you say, by both prosecution and defence.
Yes.
Have you also been appointed in civil cases?
Yes, but not very many. I've done a lot of work in the family court, obviously because of fears for the safety of siblings. So yes, I've covered most courts.
And I understand from your CV that you've given evidence in court or in inquiries more than 150 times.
Yes, yes. This is over a long time, but yes, yeah.
Yes. And you're published, you've published articles and been involved in the publication of books and articles?
Yes, I've more than 300 published articles. I've lost track of how many book chapters I've written, but and of the 300 articles, more than 80 reflect directly on fractures, fracture healing, the mechanisms by which fracture occurs, and then how that can be recognised pathologically, and that also makes up a number of the chapters that I've written.
And if we move on to slide 2, do we see one of the, as I understand it, you contributed a chapter to the book investigating the Belfast mummy, is that correct?
That's correct, yes. This is, there's, as well as being able to look at large populations, the sorts of techniques that I've employed in looking at mummies, and in particular into the decomposed tissues, are applicable to understanding individuals, and that gives you a little sort of snapshot of how people were. This lady is known as Takabuti. The top of the two right articles looks at her maternal genome. So this is the DNA that she has that comes through her maternal line, and this haplotype, it's just a name, of H4A1, is an interesting one because it's only ever been described previously in Central Europe, and particularly in Germany, in relationship to a group of people known as the Beaker people because of the artifacts that they left behind. And from that and some of the other molecular work we've done, we were able to show this maternal lineage being integrated into the sort of rich areas of ancient Egyptian society. And when my Egyptological colleagues saw this, they were able then to piece together interesting stories. I don't mean that as untruths, but stories around how women were integrated. Women from elsewhere within Europe were integrated into this very rich society of people living along the Nile Valley. We were also able, that's what the bottom paper talks about. It's a new word that we invented, which is the paleobiography. So this is learning about a person and then using that to better understand what was going on in the world at the time, or at least in ancient Egypt at the time. And we were also able to piece together her last few hours of life. Some samples were taken from her muscles, which I analysed using molecular techniques, which showed that she'd been running for at least 2 hours prior to her death. And when we looked at the mummy in more detail using very clever imaging techniques, we were able to show that she'd been killed by a bronze axe. And nobody had known about this, despite the fact that the mummy had been in Belfast since, I think, 1823. And we were able to demonstrate how she died. And this happened to coincide with a time when Thebes, which was where she was from, was under attack from external forces. And so I think with all of that information, we were able to piece together the fact that she was being chased through the streets, probably by a soldier, because she was eventually killed with an axe, at a time when Thebes was being sacked. So an interesting way of looking at who these people are, and even little nuggets like that one, showing what life must have been like in a sort of war-torn area like that.
And a moment ago you talked about mummified tissue and decomposed tissue, and I know that that's relevant to the circumstances we're looking at today. Can you explain briefly the differences between normal tissue and decomposing tissue and mummified tissue?
Yeah, normal tissue has a structure to it. It has live cells within it, and down the microscope you can see the cells, you can see the structure of the tissue. As decomposition sets in, and decomposition can be a generalized decomposition or a very focal decomposition, you get invasion of organisms, many of which come from yourself. We have a lot of bacteria that live in our bowels, for instance, and they can break out of the bowel and start to damage the tissue, and a lot of fungi as well. We have fungi in our mouths and so on all the time, and they can infiltrate into the tissues and start to destroy them. One of the tenets of Egyptian life was that you would go to the afterlife if you were good and you passed the test. And if that was to be the case, then your body would need to be preserved. And that was why in cases like Tutankhamun, there were so many artifacts put in with the body as well, because they will be used in the afterlife. And in order to prevent breakdown of the tissues, the Egyptians used mummification techniques. What they hadn't realized is that although the exterior of the body looked perfectly normal, there was still some decomposition that had occurred in the tissues during the time of mummification. Even though they removed all the internal organs and put them into special jars and things, these tissues were decomposed. And so one of the things that we had to do in order to begin to study what led up to these papers and these chapters in the book were to see what molecular techniques could be used in identifying different types of tissues that had and the processes going on within them that had occurred during decomposition. And in looking at medico-legal cases, quite often bodies take a little while to be discovered, or they're buried, and when those tissues were sent to me, I used the same techniques as I later used in mummified tissue, because they're sort of comparable.
Thank you. So you're using similar techniques depending on what type of tissue it is and how long it's been decomposing?
Yeah.
Can we move on to the next slide, please? And this is where you begin to talk about the initial report on Mr. Bio's isolated left first rib fracture. And I think when you were first approached by the Crown Office, you were sent a letter of instruction.
Yeah.
I don't need to go to that, but for those who are interested, it stated the 16th of March 2017.
That's correct.
And it's COPFS 03578. And I think the Crown explained to you when they first got in touch that there'd been a post-mortem on the 4th of May 2015, that there'd been an X-ray, a skeletal survey and a CT scan had been carried out. And the skeletal survey was the 27th of May, the CT scan was the 28th of May, I think.
I think the skeletal survey was done before the first post-mortem, and then a new study was undertaken.
And then it was later. And they were interested in attempting to clarify the role, this is Crown Office, that restraint played in Mr. Bio's death. And they said it was clear the apparent fracture will not have caused the death, but it may be significant re-establishing the force and mechanism of restraint used by officers.
Yes.
And I think it's fair to say from my reading of your statement, you agree that the fracture did not cause or contribute to Mr. Bio's death.
That's correct, yes.
And I think we heard last week from Dr. Shearer, the pathologist, that she also took that view.
Yes.
And then you prepared an initial draft on the 3rd of May 2017 and a final report on the 3rd of July 2017. Yes. And that the number of that is COPFS 00037. And if we could maybe move on to the next slide, please. So we've heard that the rib which was fractured was the first left rib.
Yes.
And you were given that information, you were given some information by the Crown about possible causes of that fracture. And you were asked to reflect on this and give your views.
Yes.
Now this slide, I'm hoping you'll be able to explain to us where exactly is the first left fracture and what these images show.
So there are 4 images here. The top left-hand image shows in red the position of the 2 first ribs, the one on the left and the one on the right. As you can see, they're rather different from the other ribs in that they really form the base of the neck. And what's also been put onto this image in a sort of background is the distribution of fat and skin and muscle that gives rise to the shape of a body. You can see here that the first ribs are, for quite a lot of their length, higher than the shoulders. The right hand top image shows what in medicine we would call the relationships of the first rib to the other ribs and to the other bones in that area. The first rib at the front is closely related to what touches the clavicle, the collarbone, And that's the bone that you can see going from within the red circle out towards the shoulder.
We have a facility on our screens, and it allows you to touch the screen. You can either use touch it and get a red circle, or you can touch it and get a line if you drag your finger along the screen.
Okay.
And I wondered if you could identify for us, by maybe using a line, the clavicle that you're describing.
Yes, this is the clavicle.
And if you make a mistake, don't worry, we can delete it.
It's a bendy line I need.
All right.
Okay, but I think that indicates the line of the clavicle, and you can see that it's not a straight bone, but
It's not a straight bone, and it goes to the front of the neck,
yes, that's
to
correct.
the top of the shoulder.
Yes, it starts from the top of the breastbone, so it starts about here, and it goes up into the neck.
And the first rib, looking at the image on the top right-hand side, does it go from the front underneath the clavicle?
It does, yes. Yes, it goes underneath the clavicle and then goes upwards towards the spine. And the spine, if I can just touch it, is there. Oh.
Do you want to try that again? There
Yeah.
it is, right.
Yes. So number 2 is the spine. The spine is made up of blocks of bone called the vertebrae, and we can see 2 vertebrae there inside, parts of them inside that circle. They also have bits that stick out at the sides, which are known as the ala or wings, and the first rib articulates. It has a joint with the ala of the vertebra just there, and again just here where it touches the body. Sorry, that's not quite in the right place. So there are 2 joints at the top of the rib.
And without wanting to make it too complicated, I wonder if you could identify for us the second rib, and if we can get a squiggly line, that might. No, we won't be getting a squiggly line. We'll just go with the. I'll appreciate it. It may have limitations, but.
Well, if we start here.
Right. That's it. Yes, I can see it on the screen.
All right.
So
hasn't come
we're
up on
looking at that image. It's towards the bottom. There's a white area.
Yes, the ribs join onto the breastbone with a piece of cartilage. It's not quite the same as a normal joint like the elbow or the wrist.
Right. And that's why it appears in the top left-hand image. The red line doesn't go all the way to the sternum.
Yes, that's correct.
So you were pointing to the bottom of that image. If you just point to that again, is that the start of the second rib?
That's the start of the second rib there.
Thank you. And that again appears to go under the clavicle, is that right?
Yes, it passes under the clavicle and then curves round and then goes underneath the first rib where it joins onto the spine. So I have a number 4 on my screen. It's immediately below the number 4, I mean behind the number 4.
Thank you.
That it joins to the spine.
Right. Thank you. And then can you tell us about the images on the bottom of this slide?
Yes. The left-hand picture is a drawing of the right-hand side of the neck, and the clavicle is right underneath the skin. The collarbone is right underneath the skin, just there, and you can follow it along. And then there are muscles that run up the neck. They join about here, but if you look below, you can see that the muscles running from the end of the clavicle nearest the breastbone up into the neck. And behind all of those structures and you can feel it in yourself, is a large chunk of muscle which comes from the scapula, the shoulder blade. That is just demonstrated in the right-hand image. I've removed the names of these various muscles, which is why we're left with the little black lines. On the left-hand side are the muscles nearest the skin of the back. So we're looking at the body from the back here, and you can see this huge muscle which goes up into the back of the neck. That's the same muscle as we can see here from the front in the left-hand diagram. And between that muscle and the scapula, the shoulder blade, the collarbone, and the muscles going up into the neck, we have a little sort of dinge, a little triangular shaped hollow. And I've tried to demonstrate that using a triangular shaped bowl because, as we've seen from the top right-hand image, over a lot of its length, the first rib is associated with other structures, other bones, at the front with the collarbone, and at the back with the second rib, and the wings, particularly of the vertebrae. But there is a little area where it is all by itself, and that happens to be in the bottom of the bowl that I've drawn there. And I did that because in the previous slide I had put in bold the words isolated and first rib. And isolated means that in this context means that it's only this rib which has been damaged, none of the other bones adjacent to it. And that has a lot of important meanings. It can be damaged, and we'll see this later, by a direct blow, but that direct blow has to go right down to the bottom of that triangular hollow. So I put this diagram in really to show if the bone had been broken by a direct blow, the sort of area that you would be looking at for that blow to have occurred without damaging any other bone.
So just to go through, if we can go back to the bottom left-hand image.
Yes.
We see the little bowl that you've captured there. Can you point on the diagram of the person's neck to where that bowl would be positioned, please?
Can I do a triangle out of 3 straight lines? Would that work?
Yes, I understand that you can, yes.
Okay, so it's... Oh.
I think you'll have to take your finger off the screen and that's it.
Yeah.
So between 7, 8 and 9,
Yes,
you've drawn
yes,
a triangular shape.
Yep.
And that's the area where there would be this, you're using the analogy of a bowl.
Yeah.
And that's the area where, I think you said, if there was a direct blow, it would have to go right into that area.
It would, yes.
Right. Thank you. And is the first left rib a very similar shape to the first right rib?
It's identical shape, yeah.
Right. Just on different sides?
Yes, and obviously the bend's in a different direction because it's on the other side.
And Dr. Shearer, in her evidence, described that area as protected by other muscles and bones and tissue. Would you agree with that description?
I would, yes. If we go to the top right-hand picture, the new circle, the new little red circle marked 3, is covered in the muscles that come up from the up from the front of the neck. The area at the back, which on the bottom left diagram is represented by 7, is a huge piece of muscle, and it's particularly powerful in us because we walk on our hind legs, if you like. So it has to support the weight of our head and all the sorts of things that happen to our head. So this is a huge chunk of muscle, and it's attached, as the bottom right picture shows, with this grey area. I can just do that to the top of the shoulder blade. So those groups of muscles, the collarbone, and to a certain extent the shoulder blade itself, offer protection in that area. So it would be very difficult, for instance, and maybe even impossible, to inflict damage solely to the part of the rib where it isn't adjacent to other bones, by putting a force or a blow or whatever that went across those structures, that went across from the collarbone, across the little hollow to the big muscles at the back, that they all are protecting that hollow from physical injury.
And I think we'll come on to it later, but I think the absence of injuries to the muscles or the skin in that area is an important factor.
It is as well, yes.
We'll come on to that. So let's look on to the next slide, please. So this is slide 4. And I think here you talk about once you'd been instructed by the Crown and you'd accepted that instruction to prepare a report, you received 6 microscope slides with certain staining on them. And that was at the end of April in 2017.
Yes.
And you reviewed those as part of your work in preparing your report.
Yes.
And I think in your report you'd actually mentioned that you also received a tissue block as well. Yeah. Can you explain to the chair what the significance of these 6 microscope slides and the staining was?
Would it be possible to go to the next slide?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So this is a very complicated slide, sir, but it's a series of images of different stages in the production of a microscope slide, and you need to follow the red arrows. So with the exception of the top middle and the bottom right image, which are of Mr. Bio's bones, the rest are there just to demonstrate what we can see. So the top left-hand picture is the sort of sample that I would be sent. It's a bone, it's a rib, and I examine it and I measure it and so on. And you can see on that rib, I'll just pop a circle around it. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. There's a slightly darker area there. That is bleeding that has come from a fracture. And what I would do is I would isolate that piece of bone by cutting it on a saw, and that then represents the next image, which is of Mr. Bio's bones, and we'll be returning to that image. What I would then do is to cut it further. And this is what happened in Edinburgh when the pathologists were making the tissue sections that I was sent. That bone was cut from left to right, as it were, from the tip of the left-hand arrow to the blunt end of the right-hand arrow. The calcium was removed, and then it was placed by a long and complicated process into paraffin wax, which is known as a tissue block. And the tissue block that you can see on the right-hand top image. Can I?
Yes.
Yep. Thanks. Yep. That is the tissue block. That contains the tissue, which you can just make out as being slightly greyer colour, attached to a plastic holder. And the mould that's been used to make that is the metal piece on the person's fingers. now we have this tissue block, which is three-dimensional. It has thickness and it has two other dimensions as well. In order for the microscope to work and to allow you to see images down it, you have to be able for light to pass through the tissue. And if you go to the middle right image at the bottom, you can see a microscope with its lenses. You can see a piece of glass, that's a microscope slide, and below that a white circle. And the light comes from below the white circle, passes through the slide, then up through the lenses to the eyes of the pathologist. In order to do that, the tissue is cut very, very thin. And it and the paraffin that's supporting it, paraffin wax that's supporting it, are round about, it's 5 microns. If I tell you that a human hair is 70 microns, you can see just how thin that piece of tissue has to be in order to allow the light to go through it. It has some peculiar, when it's cut that thinly, it has some peculiar physical properties, one of which is that you can float it on a bath of water. And the middle picture in the middle row shows 2 sections that they naturally stick to one another end to end, and when they're floated onto water they stretch out, and you can see one of the sections there, and just below it is the other section. Those tissue sections are then placed onto a microscope slide, which is a piece of glass, and that has to be very pure glass because the light passes through it and you don't want it to be distorted. But when the tissue is that thin, you can't see anything in the tissue at all. So in order to visualize it, it's stained. And a lot of these stains, people haven't really understood what they mean, except that they give very nice colours, and colours that tell you about certain structures within the tissue. In fact, it's a form of chemistry. It's colour chemistry. And so if we go to the bottom left-hand image, you can see different coloured stains that might be used in different settings for staining the tissue. And in the slide to its right, you can make out that the person is holding between their thumbs and first fingers a microscope slide, and the tissue there has been stained blue. It's then looked at under the microscope, and the sort of image that you see is the image at the bottom right, and that is from Mr. Bio's slides. One way of thinking about the way in which a tissue block is cut, though it's a rather crude way of looking at it, is to think of a sliced loaf or an unsliced loaf that is then sliced. And the 6 microscope slides that I was sent were different slices down through that loaf of bread, down through the tissue block. So if we could go back to the previous slide. So the 6 microscope slides came from the same tissue block. And 3 of the slides that I was sent had been stained with what's called H&E, which is a mixture of 2 stains, hematoxylin and eosin. And this is the standard stains that all histopathologists use when they're looking down the microscope at tissue. In addition, the pathologist had looked for iron. And this is a sort of Prussian blue type stain, which is called pearl stain. And the H&E slide showed us structures. The pearl stain was looking for iron, and it was negative. But what I was able to see down the microscope in the H&E stain slide, so these are 3 slides from different levels down through a 3-dimensional structure. So what you see in the 3 slides isn't identical, because you're coming down through the loaf of bread, and you might come across a hole in a loaf of bread when you're cutting it, or the shape of the loaf of bread isn't cylindrical. So they're all slightly different, but they are from the same piece of tissue. and it was quite clear that there was a fracture present. But when I looked at greater magnification, I could see that there was tissue decomposition that had occurred to the tissue before it was before it was processed using the techniques I've just shown you. Because of tissue decomposition, some of the features that I use to look for bleeding weren't present. But nevertheless, there were appearances that I thought did demonstrate bleeding, and that the bleeding was into the fracture, and more importantly, perhaps, into the bone marrow, and particularly the soft tissues on either side of the piece of bone. I also saw something in the bone which is called osteocyte necrosis. This is a term that's been used for some time, and we now know that the term itself is wrong, but I will use it. We need to understand really that osteocyte necrosis is actually not the cells dying because they've been deprived of nutrients, but the cells are actually committing suicide. It's a process that's known as apoptosis. And it's an important finding in bone that's adjacent to a fracture line. The lower two, the bleeding particularly into the soft tissues and the presence of osteocyte necrosis indicate that the fracture occurred during life. And they are important features for proving that. But although I was certain about the osteocyte necrosis, I wasn't certain about the bleeding because of tissue decomposition. And this is where I started to use the molecular techniques that we were discussing with the mummies.
Can I ask you a few more questions about this slide? You've talked about pearls being a stain to identify iron. And why is the presence or absence of iron important in terms of what the job that you were trying to do?
The red blood cells contain hemoglobin, and hemoglobin contains iron. And it contains iron in what's called the ferrous state. The pearl stain will only pick up iron in the ferric state, so it has to undergo changes following the hemorrhage before the pearl stain can pick it up. And that takes time. And so when you do a pearl stain, you're really looking to see one of the effects of hemorrhage, but hemorrhage that occurred several hours, maybe many hours, prior to death. So the pearl stain was negative, which means that if there was hemorrhage present, if there had been hemorrhage present, that hemorrhage had not occurred had occurred rather closer to death than it normally takes for the body to convert iron from its ferrous to its ferric state.
So the pearl stain is not as sensitive, but it can identify hemorrhage or blood in the stain, but it would have to have been there for a number of hours.
Yes.
So any blood or hemorrhage that had occurred in a shorter period of time would not be identified by a pearl stain.
That's correct, yes.
So the Crown Office stains you were sent, the pearl stain didn't show any hemorrhage or blood in the stain using that test.
So it wasn't helpful in the sense that had there been pearl staining there, then I know there would have been iron in the tissues, which means that iron would have to have come from hemorrhage. But if I could demonstrate hemorrhage by another means, then the pearls gives us a sort of time point beyond which the fracture had not occurred. Sorry, that wasn't very good English.
So if the fracture had occurred perhaps the day before, you may have been able to detect that from the pearl stain.
Yes.
And you said at the third bullet point there, appearances suspicious of bleeding into the fracture. Now, was this something that you were able to witness yourself looking through the microscope?
It was, yes.
So despite the negative pearl stain, you yourself could actually see what looked like possible bleeding?
Yes, what looked like bleeding, but that had undergone decomposition.
Right. And so in light of that, and in light of the fact you could see these signs of osteocyte necrosis, what did that then cause you to, what steps did you take in light of that?
Okay. There were two major questions that I wanted to ask. The first was why there was tissue decomposition. The second was if there is hemorrhage into the tissues, is there a better way than using pearl stain to demonstrate that there had been hemorrhage? And in doing that, I had to look at the changes in the tissue and say, could anything else have caused these changes in the tissue? So one was excluding and the other one was including whether or not there had been hemorrhage. And I think on some of the subsequent slides to the next one, I can show you some of the things that I saw.
Let's look at the next slide, if we may. And you've taken us through that slide.
Yes, I apologise, it was in the wrong
No,
order.
not at all. And then the next one, please. Or just before we leave that, the bottom right hand, we see the pink coloured slide, the image from the pink staining.
Yes, the predominant pink staining that you can see there is bone. And the bone is very rich in protein, and as a consequence stains pink with the H&E stain.
So that's an example of the H&E stain, and that's what your histopathologist will do commonly.
Always, yes.
Always. And then let's look at the next slide, please. And this looks to the right-hand side like further images of the H&E stains.
Yes.
Tell us about the images you have here.
Okay, so just to explain these images, excuse me. Sorry, just to explain these images, they are my attempt to show what bone looks like once it's been sectioned. So if you imagine that the bone is a cylinder, and a thick-walled cylinder, the outer part of that is called the cortex, and then there's a space down the middle, and that contains bone marrow. If you take a section down through that is very, very thin, you will end up with the two cortices, one either side of the bone marrow. And within the bone marrow, or crossing the bone marrow, are thin pieces of bone, which I've tried to demonstrate with those thin blue lines passing from one cortex to the other. So you've lost the cylindrical shape, and what you see now is just the two sides of the cylinder, and then anything that's in the middle and crossing it. And the third diagram just shows what you might expect to find if there had been a fracture, and so the bones were no longer in continuity.
So the zigzag that we see on the
Yes.
bottom left is an image of a
fracture.
indicative of a fracture.
Yes.
And then the stains we see on the right-hand side, tell us what we see here.
Okay. The easiest one to understand is the central image, and you can see the two pieces of cortical bone which correspond to the middle of the three left-hand images. And you can see also little pink strands crossing it, crossing the white space between the two cortices, and there this meshwork of bone which is also shown on the middle left image.
And then at the bottom, is that simply a close-up of what we see?
Yes, so what I've done is I put the green box around an area that I wanted to show to the inquiry. If you go to that bottom image, you can see all of one cortex on the left and a part of a cortex on the right, and little bits of bone which are also this dense pink colour, that are part of the bone meshwork that's crossing the bone marrow. But the purpose of this image is not really to show the bone, but to show the bone marrow itself. And can I use? Yeah, circle.
Would you like a circle?
Inside the circle there is nothing, and outside the circle are the edges of a large hole. And if you look up to the left and upwards of the number 1, you can see other holes within the bone marrow. Those are not natural holes within the bone marrow. Many of the organisms that cause decomposition make gas, and as they make the gas expands, and particularly in very soft tissues like the bone marrow, it pushes the bone marrow out to the sides, leaving these holes. And if I were to show you at much higher magnification, you would see also that the cellular structure within that bone marrow has also been lost. It's become, looks as if someone's wiped it. And those two features are the features of decomposition that perturbed the way in which I would normally look at aging fractures.
So any sort of gaps or areas of white that aren't stained pink were the signs of decomposition that you were able to identify?
That's correct, yes.
And you wanted to ask some further questions about
Yes,
why
as to
that
what had caused it. Yeah,
existed.
yeah.
Will we move on to the next
Please,
slide?
yeah. I have said that one of the things that I saw was a fracture. So if you can cast your minds back to the bottom of the 3 left-hand images, the drawings that I'd done with the streak of lightning going through them. The left-hand picture shows a fracture from a little distance. It's a lower magnification of the picture on the right. And the green line represents the line of the fracture. And to the left of the fracture line and above it, you can see a green arrow. And that points to a piece of bone which has been fractured away from the fracture line. If I could have a straight line. Thank you. That is the extent of the piece of bone, the bone's peculiar shape, which is why with the straight lines it appears that there are gaps, but there aren't. That's a single piece of bone. And everything to the bottom right of that line is also a piece of bone. And so the fracture line separates these two pieces of bone, and that's effectively what a fracture does.
So there's the cortex on either side of the bone,
Yep.
which is the sort of more dense pink staining.
Yep.
The area in the middle is the bone marrow,
Yep.
again with pink staining. The whiter area towards the sort of second half of that image, is that gas from decomposition or
well, there
something
is,
else?
No, there is gas there, but it is the normal marrow space. So where the green line goes through the marrow is shown in the right-hand picture because it is not normal marrow.
And can you point to that on the right-hand image?
Yes. If you look at the blue arrow and just follow it down, so if I could have a line. sorry, that's just an enlargement of the red line 6 and 7 is the same area as the green line in the left-hand image. And you can see that there is very little gas. There's no bone marrow, which is sort of filigree of blue and pink. And instead there's this very dense pink material below the blue arrow, and you can see similar areas either side of the line marked 6, where there is also pale, somewhat homogeneous tissue. One of the features, though, of the area I'm showing with the green arrow is that it is broken up into lines. That's a process that I call lamellation, and hemorrhage, as it undergoes decomposition, can form this lamellar pattern. The lines, however, could represent tissue that has been forced into the fracture crack from outside, or, it's very rare, but as I alluded to earlier, there are fungi that can contribute to the decomposition processes, and they have long filaments. They have rounded bodies and long filaments, and of course long filaments could have that sort of structure as well. So the question I was wanting to ask as far as these two images are concerned is, what was the nature of that pink material that filled the fracture gap? Was it some tissue that had been forced in? Was it fungal material? Was it hemorrhage? And if it was hemorrhage, what components of normal hemorrhage and clot formation were present?
Let's look at the next slide. And is this further examples of the stains, H&E stains?
Yes, this is the H&E stain. I said that we use this term osteocyte necrosis, and I thought the inquiry would be helped if I could demonstrate what I mean by osteocyte necrosis. So there are two squares on a section that we've already seen previously with the fracture line running through it. And if we look at the red square and what that shows, there is pink coloration over most of it, and that is the bone. But you will also see little blue spots. The blue spots have picked up the hematoxylin stain, not the eosin stain, which is the pink one, but the hematoxylin stain, which is blue. And those are the cells that live inside bone itself. And they are called osteocytes, which just means bone cells. And you can see that there is a scattering of blue dots across that piece of bone. So that is normal bone in terms of osteocytes that are contained within it. And they live in little holes called lacunae. When the cells die, the lacunae remain. So if we go to the top image, which comes from the edge of the fracture, and I outlined the piece of bone on the left-hand side, this green square comes from the fracture immediately, from the bone, immediately adjacent to the fracture. And if you look first of all at the pink stain, you can see that the bone has frayed. You see there's a little sort of little frill along the bottom. This is the way in which, at the microscopic level, bone fractures. It fractures into pieces, and it pulls apart like this.
And would you just point to that on the screen?
Yep.
I think
Can I
we can
have a
all see it, but just
circle?
in case.
Yeah, thanks. If the circle were bigger,
Yes.
Can I stretch it?
I think they can extend it, but that general area where we see the white marks going up into the bone?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Now if we go into the bone itself, you can see 2 or 3 blue dots in the bone.
Do you want to
Yep.
highlight those?
Circle again, sorry. Thank you. Oh, well, I managed to take the line through 2 of them, but you can see one in the middle.
And what do they show?
They show live osteocytes in the sense that they were alive when the tissue was taken, and then all processes of decomposition cease by the way in which the tissue is processed after that. If you look at everywhere else in that piece of bone, you can just make out white holes. If I, let's try that. Let's try that. You see just inside the circle are 2 small white holes, and if you look at the live cells, you could imagine that something of that size lived in those holes. And once you get your eye in, all the holes in that area, and in fact in most of this piece of bone, are empty. Is that clear enough? Yeah, thank you, sir. And that's what's meant by osteocyte necrosis. But as I say, it isn't necrosis. Normal bone, even after someone has died, and remember this piece of bone was removed, about a month after Mr. Bayou died, still contain normal nuclei. So the piece at the top reflects cell death that's occurred as a consequence of the fracture. And we now know that this is suicide by the cells, this process known as apoptosis. And a lot of my evidence from here onwards will talk about osteocyte necrosis and the number of cells that are present and what that might mean to timing, aging of fracture.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. So here you've posed some questions that you asked yourself. Tell us about those.
Okay. So was a fracture present? Yes. I've seen that and I've showed that to you. And could I see osteocyte necrosis, a process that starts in life? Yes, I could. I wasn't anticipating seeing bone tissue in which decomposition was present. So I've put a question mark next to that because I wanted to know why decomposition was present. I also wasn't sure that I had seen bleeding. I thought I had, but I wanted to be more sure, if you like. And the reason that I wasn't able to see the bleeding was because of decomposition. One of the first things that undergoes decomposition are red blood cells, and it's looking at red blood cells in tissue that allow us to look for hemorrhage. And I wanted to know not just whether it was present, but also the amount and distribution of hemorrhage. And when you get hemorrhage into a tissue, and we might best recognize this when we get hemorrhage onto the surface of our skin, eventually a scab will form. And a scab has got it's got lots of components, but it's got 2 main components. One of them is red blood cells, and the other is this molecule called fibrin. And fibrin has a precursor molecule which circulates in the blood all the time. And when it leaves the blood and leaves blood vessels, when the blood vessels are damaged due to tissue injury, in this case fracture, the fibrin starts to form, and it forms a meshwork that binds the red blood cells together, and that's what we recognize as a scab eventually. And down the microscope, you can't recognize the very earliest stages of fibrin formation. The fibrin, as its name would suggest, is a fibrillar protein. It's long strands of protein, and the fibrin is forms in these strands, and then the strands bind together, they get thicker, and it's only once they reach a certain size that you can start to see them down the microscope.
So if you're bleeding in life, and how long is it before the fibrin starts to be something that you can see? Obviously under a microscope. But
Yeah. So it's first seen at round about 6 hours. It's usually visible by 12 hours, and it's very, very obvious at 24 hours.
So if you were asked to look for and found fibrin, does that help you identify the timing of when the bleeding started?
Yes, and in this particular case, I felt that it indicated that the fracture that led to hemorrhage, if there were hemorrhage there, had occurred less than 6 hours before death, but I hadn't any proof that there wasn't fibrin present, and that was one of the special stains that I asked for.
And so this special stain would allow you to start to narrow down the timing of the fracture.
Yes, and also to recognise whether hemorrhage was present or not. Yeah. And
you've told us earlier the Perel stain was negative.
Yes.
For iron, which means negative for red blood.
Yeah. And finally, the processes that I've described so far all originate within the blood. So the hemorrhage, this is red blood cells coming out of the blood. The fibrin is a molecule that comes out of the blood. And these are, formation of fibrin is a chemical reaction that occurs in tissue where there's been hemorrhage. Eventually, the bone will start to heal itself. And you can recognize that even in decomposed bone, because you saw in the images that I've shown that the bone is this pink color, and the bone itself hasn't changed as a consequence of decomposition. And the bone healing also starts to form a bony-like tissue and then proper bone, and that would be not completely immune from decomposition, but largely immune from decomposition. So if we'd said that, we know what time that would have started, and so we've got now a distant time from death when that hemorrhage could not have been, the fracture could not have been older than a certain time, because there was no bone healing.
And if you were alive and fractured a bone, how long would it take for your body and the bone to actually start that process of healing so that you could see it if you were looking at a microscope?
Excuse me, sorry. The very, very earliest changes occur around about 24, 36 hours after a fracture has occurred. By the time you start to see something that looks like bone, you're looking at, there's a sort of precursor to the bone that you can detect. By the time you're looking at bone, you're looking at 48, 72 hours, something along those lines.
So if a fracture had occurred 46, 72 hours before someone passed away, you would be able to see changes under the microscope.
Yes, even if the tissue was
healing.
Yes, even if the tissue was decomposed.
Even if it's decomposed, that's something you can identify.
Yes.
And that wasn't the case here.
No.
So you've put a red cross next to
That's
that.
correct. Yeah, and I can be sure of that. But the yellow question marks, orangey question marks, are really, those were the questions that I needed to ask of the pathologists who'd originally taken the samples.
So in terms of the process you followed, you were able to rule out certain things, i.e. the bone healing marked by the Red Cross. Other things you had question marks about, and you wanted further information before you were able to rule those out or rule them in.
Yes.
And those included all these items which had the yellow question marks on this slide.
That's correct, yes.
So the presence of fibrin and the bleeding, the hemorrhage, and the amount or distribution of that hemorrhage or bleeding.
Yep.
You wanted to ask about the decomposition.
Yep.
And then one of the things that you did see, and you've got a green a green tick next to it, is the osteocyte necrosis.
Yes, and that was the one thing that I saw which indicated that this fracture had occurred in life.
And that can only happen if you're alive when the fracture occurs.
Yes.
So as soon as you saw that, you had an initial indication at least that this is something that had happened when
Yes, but
he
I
was
needed
alive.
more evidence, and that was looking for the bleeding.
Right. And at that stage, you've said there more than 2 hours before death. Is that when the osteocyte necrosis can start to be visible to you?
At the time, that
Sorry,
was...
yes, in 2017.
Yeah, in 2017, with the knowledge that I had then, which was both my own knowledge and understanding, but also information that I'd been given as part of the request for me to do the work. I believed that the fact that I could see osteocyte necrosis and that Mr. Bayou was an adult meant that the process had occurred more than 2 hours before his death.
Thank you. Now, I know that we will be coming on later on to the developments that have taken place since 2017, so we'll come back to that. But we're now, I think we have an understanding of the questions you had in your own mind. And we're going to move on now to the next slide and to talk about what happened after you'd determined these questions. But I'm conscious of the time. And I wonder
Would this be a convenient point to take a break then? 20-minute break.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Square.
Thank you. Just prior to the break, we had heard from you about the questions that you had in your mind that you wanted more information about. So let's look at slide 11, which is the next slide. And here you talk about the sort of subsequent events. Here we are, subsequent studies in 2017. And you've identified the questions here. Why was decomposition present? And components of hemorrhage. And you've talked about hemorrhage present, red blood cells, and fibrin allows aging, visible more than 6 hours old. Can you just summarise what we see on this slide?
Yes, so really this was setting up the ways in which I was going to look for hemorrhage and in the sense of looking for red blood cells, and also for looking at how I might see fibrin. And in order to see those two structures, I needed to do some special stains which would identify, even in decomposed tissue, whether these were present or not. And the stains that we've seen so far have been pink and white and with some blue. But now we're going into other different colours of stains, which are, as I explained, sort of visual chemistry, colour chemistry, and they were designed to pick out these individual components, particularly the red blood cells, particularly the fibrin, if it was present, and but then also to exclude some of the other things that I mentioned that could have given this appearance inside the fracture gap.
And am I right in saying that this is an area with these special stains where really you're embarking on something that you have experience in, but not every pathologist would have experience in at all?
Yeah, these are particularly used in specialist bone and joint pathology, particularly bone pathology, and the reason that there are so few bone pathologists is the need for bone pathologists isn't particularly great. So we work in a centre where material is sent into us, whether that's diagnostic material, whether it's medical legal type of material or whatever. So there will be no reason why other pathologists would have the level of experience that you need to be able to interpret these stains.
And is it the case that other pathologists maybe have never worked with these special stains and don't have any experience of analysing the results?
Yeah, particularly in this setting, yes.
Yeah. So let's move on to slide 12, please. And the first question you have here is, why was decomposition present? Tell us what happened in relation to that issue.
So I sent an email saying, why was there decomposition present, and what had happened that led to the retrieval of this particular piece of tissue from the fracture. And the whole area of identifying fractures is very, very difficult, particularly unusual fractures in unusual settings. And even very experienced radiologists had not identified on X-rays it transpired, had identified the fracture, nor at post-mortem examination had the pathologist recognised the fracture. It's in a peculiar place, and as we've seen, although my images are very large, they're highly magnified images, that the break itself was small and had this sort of diagonal appearance to it, which tends to hide it.
We've heard evidence from Dr. Shearer that she didn't see it initially at the post-mortem, and she said it's very rare to have a fracture in the first. This one was
very rare indeed, and for it to be restricted to the first rib, an isolated first rib, is extraordinarily rare.
Thank you. So that's what you mean when you say an unusual fracture in an unusual setting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And this was something that I felt showed the sort of character of the doctors who were responsible for looking at these tests and things, is that the radiologists went back and did a further set of studies using, I think, CT scanning, which is just for instance, it was the way in which we discovered the fractures in that mummy that I showed you. They hadn't been seen on X-ray. It's got that level of sensitivity. And there they noticed an isolated first rib fracture. They thought it was affecting just one of the two cortices, but as you can see, the fracture didn't. But because it's on the diagonal like that, it would appear only on one side, even though it wasn't. And immediately that triggered the pathologist, Dr. Shearer, to go back and look at that site again. And there she identified a small amount of hemorrhage, and knowing from the radiology where the radiologists, the X-ray doctors, had thought that the fracture was, she then removed that piece of bone. And that was 25 days after the first post-mortem examination. And local tissue decomposition had started in that time, and that's not unusual because the bodies are kept refrigerated rather than frozen. And this was very local. It wouldn't have been noticed on the outside of Mr. Bayo's body, but it was that delay that caused the tissue to have decomposed in that time.
So we heard from Dr. Shearer that the post-mortem was carried out on the 4th of May. He died on the 3rd. The post-mortem was the 4th. There was an initial X-ray or skeletal survey on the 13th of May. There was no sign of the fracture. There was another X-ray done on the 27th of May. CT scan 28th, and she went back in to view it herself on the 29th of May.
Yeah, you can see from the proximity of all of those actions just how careful the doctors have been and how it triggered a need to do something immediately.
Okay. So the 25-day period, was that the period during which some process of decomposition had begun?
Yes, even in a refrigerated body that would occur.
Dr. Shearer had explained that refrigeration can slow down that process, but it can't stop it completely.
That's correct.
And
yes.
she explained that they don't normally freeze bodies.
Yeah.
Thank you. So you were given an explanation as to the decomposition, and then let's move on to the next slide, which is 13, and the next questions you had here were start nature of any hemorrhage. Talk us through this slide.
Okay. This is really just an extension of a part of one of the previous slides that I saw you, but these were the questions that I was asking myself. So we have, if there's going to be hemorrhage there should be red blood cells. There wasn't red blood cells because of the decomposition process. So it may be that there were never red blood cells, or that there were red blood cells that had broken down. I wanted to see how far any red blood cells that might have been involved in hemorrhage had travelled. And for that I needed to know something about the amount of blood and the amount and the distribution of the blood. The importance of that is that it is possible, following death, for bones to bleed if they're fractured. Doesn't do very much, and it only occurs for a few hours after death. But you can sometimes get post-mortem fractures that are associated with a small amount of hemorrhage. The pressure inside the bloodstream is phenomenal, and if during life a bone breaks, then blood will be forced out under tremendous pressure, enough to burst through into the bone marrow, but particularly to burst outside the bone of a fracture into the soft tissues around that. There's some very dense soft tissues that are on the outside of a bone, but but an in-life fracture can lead to hemorrhage that passes through that and into the surrounding tissue. So that's, I wanted to know how much blood there was there, and was its distribution such as to suggest that this was an ante-mortem hemorrhage, so where did it go? I also wanted to find out if there was fibrin. I didn't see any fibrin, and it has a slightly characteristic morphology. So, I wanted to know if there was any fibrin at all, and there are fortunately some excellent special stains that allow you to look at that. Then I wanted to know what the rest of the material in the in that fracture line was, and I showed you those sort of streaky appearances. That could have been tissue that had been introduced from outside. At the time of fracture or at the time of post-mortem, whatever, you can get little bits of tissue that are forced in. And of course, although it looks large on my slides that I've shown you, this is a tiny, thin fracture with material in it. So really, I did those stains to make sure that I did stains to look for the debris in the fracture line to make sure that I could exclude it being from somewhere else. And then, as I say, there are fungi that are part of the decomposition process, and they are filamentous. They've got long arms that come out from a rounded body, and I wanted to make sure that that some of the things I was looking at weren't fungi, because they can disturb the picture greatly, and you can, they mimic a lot of different things.
I'd like to look at the next slide, 14, which shows the tissue stain tissue that you were talking about earlier, and this is a larger image of one that we saw in the earlier slide. And you say here, sent images of fracture site. Can you talk us through this, please?
Yes, can I just first draw your attention to outside the circle, particularly at sort of, what we're looking at, 11 o'clock. You can see some little white dots overlying the pink.
Could you touch the screen and highlight those for us?
In that area, these are bubbles, and these are bubbles in the soft tissue, and they are gas bubbles. And I showed you the effects that the gas can have on bone marrow, but in soft tissues like the ones that you find around bone bits of fat and so on, you get these little bubbles. So there's evidence here of decomposition, and when you start to look, you can see more and more and more of these bubbles. But the bit in the circular area, to the left and to the right of the circle, are bits of bone. They're the two parts of the rib, and Dr. Shearer would have taken this sample in order to have the fracture at the centre of the sample, and also at the centre of the sample you can see this dark red colour. I felt that was sufficient evidence of hemorrhage to be worth pursuing, and that could I have a line? That red line marks the edge of the bone, and you can see that there'll be one above that as well, but it's this one I'm looking at, and you can see that the hemorrhage, or that dark red area, extends beyond the edge of the bone, which would be one of the things that I would want to look at in more detail to see if there had been hemorrhage during life. I said you need to have pressure, and the pressure forces the blood out.
So the dark red area seems to have extended beyond where the bone is.
Yes.
And that could be because of the pressure during life of the blood.
Yes.
Moving away
yes,
from
and I don't think you would have seen that had the fracture occurred after death.
So if it had been a fracture after death or post-mortem, you may not have seen that dark red area to that extent.
No, you almost certainly wouldn't.
Right. And you were talking about red blood cells, and do they break down as part of the process of decomposition, you said.
Yes. I think it's the next image. Could I?
But while you look at that, it looks darker. It looks darker there. And does that mean that the cells are still there, or is that just some sort of residue?
No, the red of red blood cells comes from the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin is contained within the red blood cells. But if the red blood cells burst, which is what happens in decomposition, then the red colour will remain for some time, because you've got the release of the hemoglobin. You can see it when it's inside the red blood cells, but you can also see it when it comes out of the red blood cells.
So this could be red from inside cells, but the cells themselves maybe are not.
Wouldn't be visible, yeah.
Right. Thank you, sorry. And at the bottom you said area circled dark red supporting possible ante-mortem hemorrhage.
Yeah.
So that's what you were thinking at that time?
It was, yes. I was sent several images. This is the one that showed that feature best.
Right. And then can we move on to the next slide, please? So I think this is slide 15. And you talk about red blood cells here. Tell us what we can see.
Okay, so if you look at the left-hand picture, and wherever I've used images that aren't my own, you'll find a little description of where the image has come from.
Right.
So the left-hand picture is a picture of red blood cells. It's in black and white, so they don't appear red, but they look like little donuts, and they are, and they're really balloons. They don't, unlike other cells, they don't have a nucleus. They're not alive in that sense. So they're little balloons that are filled with hemoglobin. And like balloons, they have an outer surface to them, which, so if you think about a balloon, the thing that you get in the shop is just the surface, and you fill it with air. And that's the same with the red blood cells, except they're filled with hemoglobin. And when they burst, although you can't as part of decomposition, although you can't recognize them because you can't see their shape, because that shape doesn't exist anymore, the surface is left behind. And that's really important, because red blood cells, unlike all other cells, have this molecule, which I've written down here as glycophorin A, or Gly-A. So when the balloon bursts, there are still fragments. I mean, we've all burst balloons, and there's little bits of balloon skin on the floor. So that's what this is like. So you can't see the cell, balloon, but you do leave behind these little bits of the surface, and the surface contains this molecule, glycophorin A.
So you can identify that from testing, can you?
Yeah, and the test that we do is called immunohistochemistry, but that's a bit of a mouthful, so we always call it IHC. Okay. And IHC is a way of specifically recognizing a molecule within a tissue, and in this case, it's glycophorin A. So this will only detect glycophorin A, it can't detect anything else. And the way in which we visualize that, so we can see it down the microscope, is by a brown stain. So wherever there's glycophorin A in immunohistochemistry, then will be a brown stain.
And that's what we see in the middle image.
Yes, the middle image is slightly different from the right-hand image, which is the image that we've seen before with 2 of the 3 pieces of bone on.
That was the H&E stain.
That's the H&E stains, yes. The left-hand one is very similar to the left-hand picture in the left-hand part of the middle, but because it's a 3-dimensional structure and you're going down further and further down into the loaf of bread, the image, the shape will change. And the right-hand image has changed, and I'll explain that in just a moment. We've focused up to now on really the left-hand image, and you can see that in the brown and white stain, the line of the fracture, which was a green line that I put in, and that runs from. Can I have a line? Thank you. And that runs down through there.
That's the diagonal fracture you were talking about.
Yes, yeah. Dr. Shearer's laboratory had put more than one piece of bone into the tissue block. And that's why we have these 3 different pink bits. And as we've gone down through the tissue, the piece on the right has changed because we're looking at another area of a 3-dimensional object. And have I still got a line? Thank you. And now we can see the same fracture line, but because it's been turned over, it runs in the opposite direction, which is now the fracture that can clearly be seen in the. Can I have a circle?
So is this a different perspective, but of the same
thing?
fracture?
Yeah. So the bone was like this. It was cut into 2 halves, and the 2 halves placed down onto the. But they stuck up, and we've been gradually cutting up through them. And this area, which just looks like ordinary soft tissue, has now become the area to the above line 2, and it quite clearly has got bone and bone marrow in it. So we're now seeing properly down into that fracture on both of them. Same fracture, different areas of the same fracture. And I think the brown stain is obvious. Okay.
And the brown stain that we see contains the residue of burst red blood cells.
Yeah.
So are all the brown areas in the middle image those residue parts of the balloon skin of the red blood cells?
Yes, they are. Now, red blood cells are made in bone marrow, so you would expect something in the bone marrow as well. And if you look on the right-hand image, the bone marrow has been lost from the left-hand image as we've cut down through it. But the right-hand image, more bone marrow has appeared. And there's a relatively normal appearance above line 2. Again, can I have a circle? Thank you. So that's what bone marrow would normally look like. There's a little bit of brown in there. But when we look at the area that the yellow arrow is pointing at, we can see rather more brown material than we would have expected. But of most importance is the area indicated by the red arrow, my original red arrow, where you can see brown that's extending out beyond the edges of the bone. Down the microscope, it's easy to see the edges of the bone tissue, but the photograph makes that rather more difficult. And so I have drawn around the edges, the outer edges of the bone, and you can see the area that the red arrow is pointing to, and above that is some distance outside the red the edges of the bone.
So on where we see the number 1 on the middle image, we can see a lot of brown there.
Yep.
And then that appears to extend beyond this black line that's been drawn.
That's correct. Yes.
And am I right in understanding the black line is where the bone is seen or was seen by you?
Yeah, that's the edge of the piece of bone itself.
From this slide?
Yes.
And as you say, the brown stain extends beyond that black line.
Yes.
And what did that mean to you?
Well, that meant, first of all, the brown staining and the quantity of brown staining indicates that there was hemorrhage present. The fact that it goes outside the edge of the bone and bursts through this sort of fibrous, this sort of coating of the bone and into the soft tissues means that there had to be a high pressure of blood at the time that the fracture occurred, and that meant that the fracture occurred in life.
So this brown image is really identifying the areas of blood or hemoglobin that's come out and spread beyond that bone area.
Yes, it's the surfaces of the red blood cells where they were in life, and then as decomposition had occurred in these areas, they just left behind the sort of coverings of the balloon, which is picked up by the stain.
And if that fracture had occurred after death, would you expect to see so much brown staining beyond the
No.
the bone?
No.
Thank you. Let's move on then to slide 16, please. And we see a number of other images here.
Yes.
And are these further stains?
Yes, these are further stains. It's quite a complex slide, but it breaks down into 3 parts, which I've called MSB, EVG, and PAS. And the stains on the right-hand side come from staining manuals, and they show what the stain would normally stain up in a living tissue. The most important of these is the MSB. It stands for Marcia's Scarlet Blue, but basically visible fibrin stains an orange-red colour, and collagen stains blue. Collagen is the major supportive molecule that we have in our bodies. Everything is held together with collagen, and where I've and the left-hand pictures are the stains used in Mr. Bio's tissues. And the thing about the MSB is that fibrin comes out this really dense orange-red colour. And as you can see, there is no orange-reddy colour in the left-hand image, which is Mr. Bio's fracture site. And there is collagen. It's slightly different colour from the right-hand one, but I've indicated on the left-hand one where the blue collagen stains. But interestingly, in the middle, going from top right to bottom left, there's no blue coloration, there's no bright yellow coloration. So this isn't collagen that's been forced into the tissue as part of the fracturing process. So it shows that there's not fibrin present, but it also shows that the material, the debris in the gap, in the fracture gap, is not collagen. The next picture...
Can I just
sorry,
ask
yes,
you a
of
few
course.
questions about that? So the image on the top right, we're on the MSB staining. That's from a textbook showing textbook examples of the results of MSB staining.
Yes.
And we can see they're blue and yellow and they symbolise different things.
Yes.
So is the image on the right an image taken from a fracture?
No, the image on the right is part of a placenta, and there's a lot of fibrin in a placenta following delivery.
So it gives you a good example of the colours that you can look for and identify.
Yes, and
the fibrin comes out and develops
it's an
during
orangey red
life.
colour.
It's
Yeah.
orange red, and that exists when you have a fracture when you're alive.
Yes, if you've got visible fibrin,
Right.
yeah, it would pick it up.
Is there a time scale where the fibrin will become visible to someone looking under a microscope?
Yes, and the same applies to whether or not it's stained with MSB, and that is that you would not expect to see it less than 6 hours after, if in a fracture that has occurred less than 6 hours before the time that the fracture is removed, which in a lot of the cases, of course, is the time of death.
Right. So if there had been a fracture in life and it had occurred 6 hours prior to death, there might be the beginnings of fibrin
Yes.
starting.
Yeah.
And that would be the very strong orange colour.
Yeah.
So on the left, which is an image taken from the slides you had available from Mr. Bio, there's nothing of that.
No, the reddy colour that you can see at the top, and in fact it's the top left-hand corner of all 3 of those slides, is bone, and bone stains in a funny way. But you with these stains, just because it's bone, but nevertheless the stain is not outside the extent of the bony tissue itself.
So you were able to look at these, and as a result of that MSB stain, were you able to say to yourself that there was no visible fibrin, so
Yes.
and draw a conclusion about the timing of the fracture from
Yes,
that?
I'd had to prove first of all that there was hemorrhage, which we did with the glycophorin A stain, and now I can say, well, there was hemorrhage in this area, but hemorrhage that occurred within a time frame prior to death that did not allow fibrin to have formed, and so probably less than 6 hours, certainly less than 12 hours before death.
So you're starting to narrow down that window
Yes.
when the fracture could have occurred. And then, sorry, you were about to move on to the
Yeah.
next stain, EVG.
Yes, this is a very complex stain. The important thing to note is the picture on the right is from a ligament. And a ligament has got two components to it. It's made up of very dense collagen, but because ligaments have to stretch, they also contain another molecule called elastin, which does what it says on the tin, really. The elastin is a stretchy molecule. And the elastic Van Giesen picks up elastin.
Is that EVG?
That's EVG, yes. And the elastin is this black colour. You can see these fibrils of elastic tissue, and the brick red colour is collagen. And
So this is a different colour, but it's just because it's a different stain.
yes, and this stain is used specifically because it can show these different molecules, the collagen and the elastin, with a big contrast between the two. And
this is a textbook example again
yes,
on the right.
all the right-hand images come from textbooks, and I've put those in their little boxes to indicate where
Thank you.
you come from. And just at the bottom right-hand corner, you can make out of the left-hand middle image, you can see a little area of red, which is collagen, and that corresponds in a previous section to the one above, where the collagen came out a blue colour.
And that's where your arrow, black arrow, points, bottom
Yeah.
right-hand side.
Yeah, and there is no elastin in here, and that's important because there are rounded structures in here, and rounded structures in histopathology usually indicate blood vessels, and blood vessels tend to have elastin within their walls. So the rounded structures were not blood vessels in that sense. There are some little bits of black scattered across. They are bits of bone. As you can see, the bone also stains a sort of browny black colour. That's the piece at the top left of the image. But you can't, it's just the way that bone behaves. It's different from all other tissues in respect to the way it stains.
So on this left-hand middle image, we see the bone in the top left-hand corner, and then other areas in the remaining part of the slide, which are that dark brownish colour, if I can call it that.
Yeah, that's
the bone.
That's the bone, yeah.
Sorry.
The transcript seems to have stopped.
Oh.
I think we'll rise for a few minutes to see if we can get it back, because it is quite important when
Yes.
following
Thank you.
this evidence. So we'll rise to see if we can resolve. There's an issue with the real-time transcript that we have, so we'll
Yes.
see if we can sort that out. Well, the issue is not resolved, but I think we'll just carry on, and the stenographer will pick it up again later.
Thank you. Professor, we were talking about elastin, and we'd talked about the EVG test. You've identified on the left areas of bone. And so you'd ruled out, to some extent, that elastin was present. And what was the significance of that, as far as you're concerned? This is slide 16.
I mean, it might be possible for ligament-like tissue to be forced into that gap. But the really important thing is that amongst the debris are rounded structures, and rounded structures are often blood vessels, and blood vessels would contain elastin within their walls. That isn't completely true for bone marrow, because there are rounded structures that are blood vessels that don't contain elastin. But some of the other stains, and we'll see one in a moment, showed that they weren't those.
Right. So it wasn't inconsistent in any event with your views as they were developing that this happened ante-mortem, pre-death?
Yes.
Thank you. And let's look at the PAS stain at the bottom of the page.
This is another one of those really bright stains for picking up particular molecules, and the surface of fungi is covered in sugar, and this picks up sugars, and they stain that purple magenta colour, and you can see the filaments that I was talking about. This again is not a fracture site. This is just a control tissue that we know contains fungi, and then we know that where those purple, if you just follow the right hand arrow up, you can see a little strip of a bright purple material, and there's 2 or 3 to the right of it, some to the left, some down the bottom just above my name. When you look across to the other side, to Mr. Bayo's fracture site, there is no evidence of fungi in there, and the fungi, because they're part of the process of decomposition, would not have decomposed. And so they would, the process causing decomposition, they would not have decomposed. And so the fact that there's no staining there means that a lot of those sort of streaky looking colour changes that I've shown are not fungi.
And the fact that we don't see fungi in the slide on the bottom left, what was the significance of that to you?
Just simply because I wanted to exclude the sort of stripy material that was there being fungi. So if it's not fungi, it has to be something else. We know it's not collagen. We know it's not fibrin, so it must be some part of the clotting process that has undergone decomposition. At least that's how I interpreted it.
Right, thank you. And then let's move on to the next slide, which is 17. And I think this is where you sum up what your view of the fracture was in 2017 when you did your report for Crown Office at the time.
Yes.
Can you explain to us what your view at that stage was?
Yeah. This was a solitary left first rib fracture, and the fact that it's a solitary first rib fracture has significance as to the cause. From the fact that I could see extensive bleeding using the glycophorin A stain both within the fracture gap and outside in the soft tissues, and the presence of osteocyte necrosis, which occurs in life, means that the fracture occurred in life. Because of the osteocyte necrosis, the earliest I had ever seen that in an adult was 2 hours, and that's been the experience of the few colleagues that I have who look in this area, and that there was no visible fibrin, which should start to be seen at 6 hours, my conclusion was that the fracture probably occurred between 2 and 6 hours before death.
And you said in relation to the fact it was a solitary first rib fracture that was of significance. Can you
Yes.
explain why you said
Yeah.
that?
I've shown you a diagram of the relationships, that's other structures surrounding the first rib. And although first rib fractures themselves are rare, when they occur, they tend to occur in association with fractures of either other ribs or of the collarbone or of other structures in that area. And so if there's just a solitary first rib fracture, it limits the ways in which that fracture could have occurred.
Thank you. And we'll come on to that.
Yeah.
And so this was your view in 2017 when you prepared your report
Yes.
for Crown Office. Let's move on, please, to the next slide, 18. And then you move on here to talk about the cause of an isolated first rib fracture, generally and in this case. And then if we can move on to 19, I think you've reinserted the images to refresh our memory about the location of the first rib in relation to the other structures in the area. And then if we can move on to 20, please. And this slide is headed Causes of Isolated First Rib Fracture, either side.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, you were asked to consider the mechanism or the causes, potentially, of this fracture. And I'd like you to take us through what you've looked at in this slide. So this is...
The image on the left, or the image, is that of a first rib. You can see that it's a flat bone. It's and at the top, can I have a circle? Thank you. The two circles that I've drawn are where the bone has joints with the spine bones, with the vertebral bodies and the wing of the bone. So this is at the spine end, and there are two joints.
So the top of this image is at the back, someone's back area.
Yeah.
And the bottom of this image is towards the front, to the sternum area.
Yes, and we've got this sort of slightly irregular edge to the left-hand bottom, which is where it joined onto cartilage that breached the gap between it and the
sternum?
breastbone. Yeah, the sternum. Yeah.
So this is an image in the position that if you were looking at someone face on, their first left rib would be like this in this position. Is that right?
You'd be looking at them from
Although this would
front
be
and
above
above.
it. Yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. And the when I first drew this image, the yellow lightning thing was where I believed the fracture was from the description that I'd seen. I'm not a radiologist, but the radiology was very specific about the site where the fracture was, and this turns out to be important. And I believe it is actually the site as well now. Dr. Shearer confirmed that.
Yes, well, when you raised this, we went back to Dr. Shearer and we took her evidence last week and asked her to look at this image, and she said that we explained it was an indicative image, and she said that was correct.
Okay, thank you. There's a technical term on that image as well, and it says scalene tubercle. That's a slightly raised area on the bone, and it's sort of hatched in under the green, if you can see that. This is important when we come to the last of the indirect trauma elements that I've got, and I'll return to that if I may.
Yes, thank you.
So, there are very, very, very few people in the world who will have significant experience of isolated first rib fractures, and I am not one of those. I've seen first rib fractures. I've seen first rib fractures linked with other fractures of other bones. I can't remember whether I've actually seen any isolated first rib fractures. So in order to produce this list, I went to the medical literature and I had to go right back to the 1950s in order then to gather sufficient cases and descriptions of where these fractures occurred.
And is that an indication, Professor, of the rarity of
Yes.
an isolated first rib fracture?
Yes, yeah, very, very rare indeed. But there are doctors who take an interest in certain things like this, and they will contact their colleagues and they will get information and they will pull that all together and publish it in the medical press. And so I went to the medical press to get these potential causes of an isolated first rib fracture. So there is direct external trauma, and I've discussed that when I was talking about the triangular bowl-shaped thing. A small foot kicking directly onto that rib, that sort of size, and we can judge the sort of size just by feeling on ourselves how big that triangular area is. And that would cause a fracture in the site that I've indicated on the image. This area of the body is full of links between different bones, and there are muscles, there are tendons, there are ligaments, and one of the more common causes of this very rare fracture is falling onto an outstretched arm. And here the forces are transmitted along the arm, up into the shoulder, and then transmitted through all these ancillary structures to the first rib and can cause it to fracture. And it will only affect that rib because of the way that rib is attached to all these ancillary structures around it. A blow to the shoulder can also transmit energy in the same way as a fall onto the arm. It would, though, cause quite marked soft tissue injuries, bruising, some sort of marks that might have come from the cause. And then finally, there's this fracture caused by violent muscular contraction. That means that someone who contracts their muscles very, very hard, and the examples tend to come from people who are habitually lifting heavy loads and putting them onto their shoulders. Examples are farmers who can carry a bale of hay on both arms, or coal miners, and as I said, the literature goes back a long way. And one of the most interesting things about these, and the important from our perspective, is that they tend to occur in that green area that I've marked on the image of the rib. So when I went through and analysed all the cases that I could find, they all appeared to occur in that area. So if the fracture is away from that area, then it's unlikely to be caused by violent muscular contraction.
So this slide essentially identifies potential causes of this rare type of fracture. And and you've specifically gone to the medical literature.
Yes.
To research all the potential causes that have been identified by other doctors and written
published.
Published.
Yeah.
And so one can be direct external trauma.
Yes.
And then indirect trauma from falling on an outstretched arm, a blow to the shoulder, say if you fell or you were struck with something.
Yeah.
Although that would be ancillary to that, you may have damage to other structures like the skin or muscle or bruising or something along those lines.
When you fall on an outstretched arm, my personal experience is that you don't show the same level of damage to your hand as if someone had applied a hard force directly onto the soft tissues of your shoulder.
Thank you. And then the fracture caused by violent muscular contraction. I'm interested in the type of circumstances that could give rise to this violent muscular contraction.
Well, as I say, one of them is lifting heavy loads, and most of the cases were in people who habitually lifted heavy loads. It was part of their job, basically. They were by and large men who were doing heavy manual tasks. There are one or two descriptions of someone who wasn't used to lifting a heavy weight. There's one of a guy who lifted a mattress and a few days later started to notice pain, and that was shown to be the pain was coming from a fracture of this rib.
There's obviously different methods or manoeuvres or techniques for lifting heavy weights. In your review of the literature, was there any commonality between any of the...
There was nothing specific except that by and large there were people lifting weights up.
In front of them with...
Well, the literature wasn't that specific.
Right.
Yeah.
But you've said that that's normally in this green area that we see in the image.
These fractures, yeah.
And when you researched that as a possible cause, was there any indication of how common that is? Obviously in the context of first rib fractures being very rare.
Yeah, of the number I saw, that I reviewed, I think we were looking at something like 10 to 15% of the fractures of the first rib that were caused by this type of accident.
And can you explain from your reading, when it says violent muscular contraction, is that some sort of spasm or is it just some sort of overexertion of the muscle?
It's usually overexertion. There were one or two cases, I think, where it was due to a spasm, but by and large these were lifting heavy weights.
And then looking at the image again, could you help the chair understand, we saw in your earlier image that the first rib goes underneath the clavicle. Where would the clavicle be positioned in relation to this image?
It would go from the bottom left upwards towards the right middle. Can I have a line?
Could you have a line?
Yeah. Okay. It will run in and can I keep the line? Can I keep it on the line? Oh, sorry. Can I have another one? I'm not winning, sorry. No, I wanted to have two parallel to one another. Okay.
If you touch it, you need to make a new line.
Okay. Oh yeah, super, thank you.
Good.
In that sort of position, the scalene tubercle has got two little dinges either side of it where the blood vessels pass through going towards the neck, and that happens underneath the clavicle.
So the scalene tubercle is underneath where the clavicle would be?
Yes. Yeah.
But the lightning bolt yellow zigzag line is towards the back of the person.
Yes, and quite a long way back.
So not under or just beside the clavicle.
No.
Thank you. And thank you. Could we move on to the next slide, please, which is 21? And here I think you say, based on witness statements available at the time, my knowledge and understanding, and then you set out what your findings were. And does this relate to your findings generally or just in 2017? Or have you remained of the same view since 2017?
This particular slide refers to my view in 2017, but I have, it is my belief that these are still pertinent now.
So, thank you. Let's go through these. You have 4 bullet points here, and I see that you have the top and the bottom say unlikely in red next to them, and then you have one that's green and it says likely, and then one that is a brownie colour, possible.
Yes.
Can we look first of all at the ones you've classified as unlikely?
Okay. Although direct external trauma can cause an isolated first rib fracture, it's uncommon because of the way in which the rib is protected, and we've discussed this protected area. So it's an isolated fracture, therefore I felt that was unlikely, not impossible, but also there was no reported event of direct trauma of a type that that I felt could have caused this by directly applying force of sufficient amount into the bottom of that that little bowl that I showed, the triangular bowl.
So you drew a triangle on the image, and you have the bowl, and it would have to be a fracture in the base of that bowl.
Yes, as I say, it's well protected by the muscle at the back, supported by the shoulder blade and the clavicle at the front. And if there was sufficient force to go through past those structures, then they would have been damaged. So it would need to have been a force that went directly downwards onto the middle of the bowl. And at the time there was no evidence that had occurred.
So nothing that you could see in the statements that you were sent?
Yeah, that's correct.
And if there was direct external trauma, what would you expect to find, or would you expect to exist externally on the skin or in the muscles or anything?
Yes, again this is outside my experience and probably outside most people's experience of isolated first rib fractures caused like this. But you would imagine that there would be bruising. This is quite loose tissue, so there will be swelling, as well as a consequence of a direct blow in that area.
We've heard from Dr. Shearer, who did the post-mortem on the 4th of May, that there was no external damage to the skin, to the tissue, to the muscles, or no bruising, that type of thing. But would you have expected something along those lines to be visible?
I would have thought so. Even if it wasn't on the skin, you would have expected to have seen something in the soft tissues below the skin.
And is it significant that there is only the isolated first rib fracture in that area?
Yes, because a lot of other causes, and particular trauma, would have, I believe, would have been reflected in fractures of other bones, of damage to soft tissue, and so on.
Right. And conscious of the time, but we have heard some evidence that there was baton strikes to the left-hand side of Mr. Bio. Would a direct external trauma possibly include a baton strike?
I'm no expert on police batons, so I don't know how heavy they are. I suppose that would be on the blow to the shoulder equivalent. I can't see how a long stick-like structure put onto across here would have caused that fracture without causing damage to any other tissues.
Thank you. Well, I'm conscious of the time.
Shall we stop for lunch then and sit at 2 o'clock?